Have you ever wondered why God chooses the people that he chooses to do the things that he chooses them to do? Like, we can look around and we can see some people who seem to be doing great things for God or in history who did great things for God, but that's not most of us. Most of us are, just doing the normal stuff. Have you ever wondered the difference between that? If you haven't, well, God bless you, I have. And I wonder at times, why does God choose certain people to do things that to our eyes at least seem great, whereas to our eyes other things don't seem great? First of all, we have to understand that our eyes are not God's eyes, and God chooses everybody for a purpose that he designs for them, and whether it appears to be great to others or not doesn't matter. What matters is, are we being obedient to God? But for today's lesson, I want to take a look at that question because this chapter is going to give us an idea. Genesis 15 is going to give us an understanding of why God chose Abram. We're in the middle of, only in the middle of this story of this amazing man of God who changed everything, or that God used, and through God's power, everything changed because of Abram. And that's what this chapter today is going to give us an understanding of, and hopefully give us an understanding of how we fit into God's plan as well and how he chooses us. So let's take a look at it. Genesis 15, beginning with verse 1. After this, that is, after the division between Abram and Lot, where they each chose different places to go to live, and God used Abram to rescue Lot and his family, and they had that meeting with Melchizedek that we saw last time. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. Let's pause here for a moment because this sentence we too often skip through to get to the other stuff, as though this is just a hey, how you doing kind of a verse. And it is a greeting from God, but it's important what he says. One, don't be afraid. Why would Abram be afraid? Because there was a whole lot of uncertainty in Abram's life. He was in a place he'd never been before, and following God to a place that he was unaware of, and he didn't know what was going to happen next. There's a lot of fear potentially in that. But here's what God says: I am your shield. That's what I'll protect you from anything bad. And then here's the key that I wanted to take a look at today, whenever it is you're looking at this. I am your shield, your very great reward. God says the primary reward we are going to get from following him is him. He is our reward. If you are wanting to follow God because you think he's going to give you stuff, well, there are blessings that do follow in our obedience to God, but that's not the primary reason we follow him, any more than when you fall in love with someone and want to marry them, that you're thinking, oh, I get to marry them, and I get to have their car will now become my car or whatever. No, if that's why you're getting married, don't get married. The reason you want to get married is because you want that other person to be in your life. They are the reward of your wedding and of your marriage, and you are the reward for them. The relationship is supposed to be what we're striving for. So the great reward of Abram's faith, as described here, was a restored relationship with God, which, as we've seen already, has been now centuries of falling apart. Adam and Eve broke the covenant with God. Cain kills Abel. God destroys almost the entire earth because of the incredible sin that's going on, only to come out years later to defy God by building a tower that we were going to unite the world in without God's help, right? And then finally, God finds his one person, Abram, who says, yep, I'll go where you want to go. I'll do what you want me to do. And through Abram, God is restoring his relationship with us. But and it starts by Abram recognizing, yeah, I get to have a relationship restored with the God who made me, and that most people throughout history up until him have not had. And so the great reward of his faith was a restored relationship with God, which now through his family line would be open to everyone. Because we'll see it again later, but the covenant with Abram does not just include Abram. It includes your family, and through your family, the entire world will be blessed. So it's not even restricted. It's not restricted to Abram. It's not also not just restricted to his family. The blessing will flow through his family to the entire world. So when we look at the covenant, and we'll again a couple weeks from now we'll look at it in much more detail. The land is tied to the covenant, but it's not about the land. The blessings that Abram will receive financially is a part of the covenant, but it's not the point of the covenant. The chance to be a blessing to others is a great part of the covenant, but it's not the point of the covenant. The point of the covenant is to be in a restored relationship with God again. So it's like God was the spouse who was betrayed, going back to the spouse who betrayed him and saying, okay, I forgive you and I want you back in the house with me again. See, when you're the one who's done the betraying, you don't have the ability to go and restore the relationship again. The one who has been betrayed needs to open up the doors. The betrayer can't do it. Only the betrayed can. So we didn't have the ability to go and be made and make ourselves right with God. God had to open the door, and he does so through Abram. He says, I will be your great reward. We then move along to verse 2. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. So Abram worries, wait a minute, you're going to give me all this stuff, and you're promising that through my family the world will be blessed. I don't have a family right now. The chief servant in my household will be my legal heir. He's all I've got. I don't have any other family member. How is this going to work? And the answer, verse 4, then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir. This person who's not related to you, but who's the chief servant in your household. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. God says, You're going to have kids, and their kids will have kids, and their kids will have kids. And the offspring from you will be like the stars of the sky. They'll be uncountable. Now, what's amazing is that God would use the stars as a reference point here. He's not talking about literal numbers, but he's talking about the stars as a reference point for an uncountable number. What's amazing is at this time and today, we can only see about 5,000 stars wherever we are in our hemisphere. We can only see about 5,000 stars with the naked eye. And back then, of course, they didn't have telescopes or anything else. So the most you could see was about 5,000 stars. And that's all they knew. But God says you'll be as uncountable as the stars. 5,000 is not exactly an uncountable number. But now we know, and God knew then because he created it all, that there are in fact trillions upon trillions of stars to a point where we don't even have an idea of how to estimate how many there are. God knew that then, and he used that illustration long before we had an understanding of how many stars there are. They thought maybe 5,000 was where it topped out, but God knew better. So he uses this amazing illustration for that. Verse 6, then it goes in response to this promise that God gives him. Verse 6, it says this: Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. This is one of the Bible's great verses, but it's an interesting one when you read it. Abram believed the Lord, okay, that's clear, and he, God, credited it to him, Abram, as righteousness. The pronouns themselves can be confusing. So let me just take the pronouns out and put the nouns in so you can understand what it is intending to say. Abram believed the Lord, and God credited it to Abram as righteousness. So what it's saying here is something really interesting. I looked it up. The word credited is in the Hebrew, which is what the Old Testament was written in. The Hebrew word is chashab. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I got that little in there, right? Credited is chashab, which means to fabricate it to look like something else. Why does it have to look like something else? Here's why. Belief does not make us righteous. It's important to believe the right things, but believing does not make us righteous. Action makes us righteous. Doing the right thing is how we determine who's the good person, right? If you got three people in the room and they all believe the same thing, and one of them is behaving well and one of them is behaving badly, we go, I don't care what you believe. The one who's behaving well is good. The one who's behaving badly is bad, right? That's how we perceive it. And to a large degree, that's correctly so. But God says, You're believing me, and I'm going to turn that belief, I'm going to fabricate that belief, I'm going to interpret that belief as righteousness on your behalf. So belief does not equal righteousness, but God treated it as that. He credited it that way. He fabricated, he made righteousness out of Abram's belief. Until then, righteousness only came through behavior. And even today, again, it's an appropriate way to take a look at it outside of faith, obviously. Um, but here's what happened. Abram had no reason to believe God. He had no context for it. Why should he believe this God? What has this God done? He didn't have enough understanding of him to know. And yet somehow he could perceive that this was the God who made everything and that in fact he was the righteous judge. We have all kinds of ways to judge who God is. We've got the Bible, we've got history, we've got all kinds of ways to have seen God at work, and yet we still at times have a hard time ratcheting up enough faith to believe God. And we constantly doubt him, even though we've got all kinds of proof, way more than Abram had. Abram didn't have a word of the Bible, and we've got the entire thing. Abram didn't know about Jesus and his life and his death, his miracles, his crucifixion, his resurrection. We know all of that, and we have a hard time believing. Abram believed without any of that. He didn't even have the 10 commandments. Somehow this man just stepped up and he knew. And God said, wow, that's really something. That is an amazing amount of faith. I'm going to credit that to you as righteousness. So, based on that, let's ask and answer this question. Why was Abram chosen to start restoring the world back into right relationship with God? Because that is what God chose him to do. It was no less a feat than that. So, why didn't he pick somebody else? Why Abram? Here are 4 quick reasons why. Let me go through them. First of all, because Abram listened to God. Abram, listen. God wants a relationship with us, and it's really hard to have a relationship with someone who refuses to listen to you. Right? I mean, every married couple knows that. Why aren't you listening to me? Oh, I heard what you said. No, but you're not really paying attention, right? Abram paid attention. Abram listened. We don't listen very often. We spend our lives filling it up with so much noise. If God was yelling at us, some of us wouldn't hear because there's so much other noise going on. Abram knew to slow down, to hear, to listen to God. So first of all, when God spoke, Abram listened. Secondly, because Abram obeyed God. God shows up, he speaks. Abram is paying attention, so he hears it. And then God says, I want you to leave your comfortable home in the most civilized, advanced civilization on the face of the earth and keep walking until I tell you to stop. And it ends up being the most backwoods place that he knows of, but he does so. Right? And then when Lot comes along, um, uh, he obeys God in that too. Lot ends up in near Sodom in the place of sin, and Abram says, "I just want to be in the presence of the Lord." So Abram listened to God. Abram obeyed God. Thirdly, because Abram was a giver. Abram was a giver. Uh, he gave to Lot. Remember the story we saw it last week, right? He said to Lot, "We're going to end up fighting here because we got too much going on. You pick a place, and I'll take the leftovers." He let Lot pick first of the land that they would call the land of their inheritance. That is a big give. But he was a giver. He tithed to Melchizedek when there was no command to do so. Why? Because it was in Abram's heart to give. And then fourthly, because Abram believed God. Oh, there we go. Giver, I was one behind. And then fourthly, because Abram believed God. Now, belief here means more than simply assenting to an idea. Like something happens and somebody tells you something, you go, oh, I believe that took place. That's an acknowledgement of something that took place and you believe what somebody said. This involves more than that. This involves trust. This involves faith. This involves knowing that God is going to be someone of integrity and is going to follow through on what he said. It is basically staking everything you have on what God says. It's one thing to believe mentally and not do anything about it, but he believed to the degree that he left everything he had. He gave up everything he had and went to a place where there was nothing and said, I'm going to trust God with everything I have and everything I am. That's what belief is. It's what he understood in his head, put into action with his hands and feet. That's what he did. He believed God. All right. Now, continues on, verse 7. He, God, also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? There we go. Help my throat a little bit. This is a reasonable question. God says, I'm the one who brought you out of Ur. Remember me? I did that. I got you here. Basically, dance with the one who brung you. I got you here. I will make sure you take possession of it. But Abram asks, how can I know that I will get possession of it? How do I know that you're going to be able to do this for me? And I'm going to go aside from what a lot of people might say here and tell you that's actually a very reasonable question. Some people think, oh, that's not a good question. Just trust God. Trusting God doesn't mean you don't ask the hard questions. That is a reasonable question. I'm going to give you this land. And he goes, how? How is a reasonable question in that situation? You're allowed to ask those questions. Too often we are told that faith doesn't ask hard questions, and that's simply not true. Take a look at the Bible. The greatest people of faith ask the hardest questions over and over and over again. Why? Because God and His Word and His truth is more than up to the task of answering those questions. Don't be afraid of a faith that says you can ask hard questions. Be afraid of a faith that won't allow you to ask hard questions. Why? Because usually there's no good answers for them. So if you're in a church or you're in a situation or in a relationship where you're not allowed to ask hard questions, that's a sign of danger. If you ask hard questions and they go, well, you can't ask that, that's a lack of trust. That's a big red flag. That's a real dangerous place. It is not lack of faith to ask hard questions. Instead, it betrays a lack of faith when you're in a place where hard questions are not allowed. Right? We saw this already in the garden. The issue, as we talked about already from the serpent, wasn't that Adam and Eve might ask a question of God. It was that the serpent twisted the question because the serpent wasn't really interested in an answer. He was interested in using a question to deceive. But God has no problems with honest answers from people who really want to know what the honest questions from people who really want to know what the answer is. It's like any good teacher says, there's no dumb question. An honest question by a true seeker is always welcomed by God. All right. Now, immediately after this, in answer to how can I know if I'll be able to take the land, God walks Abram through the instructions for a really bizarre sacrifice ritual involving 5 animals: a heifer, a goat, a ram, a dove, and a pigeon. He has them cut some of them in two and arrange them in a weird way. And he has to chase the vultures away when they come to get them. And it lasts all day until Abram's about to sleep and it's getting dark. It's a very strange scenario that happens. But the real answer to Abram's question comes here in verse 13. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. There's a lot of history going on in there, but let me just summarize it this way. God is telling him, I am going to perform an amazing miracle, and it's going to take a minimum of 400 years to take place because they're going to be enslaved for 400 years. And we know, of course, that it's at least 3 generations away before that enslavement takes place. So we're talking hundreds of years down the road. And he says, you will be long dead by the time the answer comes. God tells Abram that in what we just read. So how do I know you're going to do it? Well, you're going to die before you see the answer to that, but your great, 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 how many greats do I have to add to that? Grandkids are going to see it. And the lesson to that, and of course, who's he talking to here? This is Moses writing this out for who? For Abram's great, 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 greats, who have been enslaved for 400 years, who have been taken out of that slavery by the amazing miracles of the hand of God, who are now ready to walk into the land that God promised their great, 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 and on so on grandfather Abram at this point about probably around 600 years before. So again, this is not written this is not written down now for Abram's sake. Abram isn't reading this at the time. This is being written down by Moses to say, hey, you now are about to see the answer that Abram, our great, 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 never saw in his lifetime, but that God gave him then. And here's the lesson for me that I see out of this anyway. The rewards of doing the right thing often take a long time to be seen. If you do the right thing and you continue to do the right thing and you continue to trust God and you continue to obey God and you continue to walk in his ways, you may not see the rewards for that in your lifetime. Sorry, but that's a principle of scripture. Anybody who tells you anything other than that is either lying or is not reading scripture correctly and is mistaken themselves. If you are righteous, you may see some rewards in your lifetime. Quite often, most of the time, we do see some rewards in our lifetime because living by God's principles is just wise and it makes sense in this world as well. But often, the biggest things that God promises us by living for Him will not be seen, sometimes not even within our lifetime. But Abram was always concerned about his ancestors and his those who he would be an ancestor to, his kids, his grandkids, his family line coming after him. Abram was never just about me. It's always about what about my kids? What about my grandkids? What about them? Are you going to bless them? He wanted to be sure that that happened. And so God tells him, yes, yes, your kids will be fine. It'll take a long time, but it'll come. The rewards of doing the right thing often take a long time to be seen, but long-term results are usually the lasting ones. It's a basic rule of life, let alone of faith. When something pays off quick, it doesn't last long. When something takes a while to pay off, it usually is something that sustains. So if you want faith that sustains, you're going to have to be patient. You're going to have to stay in it long term. You can't just give up when something gets difficult. That's simply not the way the world works. It is certainly not the way faith works. But we see in Abram a person who recognized that God is trustworthy. Even if I don't see the results in my lifetime, that's okay. I'm not here just for the here and now. I'm here for the long term. And for us, it's not just for the great greats of our grandkids, it's for eternity. We're going to see the reward for our faith in the long term. It may not happen now, it may not happen immediately, it may not happen in your lifetime, but it will happen. This is basic faith and maturity. Right? Psychologists and therapists call this delayed gratification. It is literally the sign of whether or not someone is maturing. Can they delay gratification? A child cannot delay gratification. Instantly, if they see something at the store, they want it now and they will throw a crazy fit until they get it. Why? Because they're not mature enough to know that if I save the money from buying that now and add it all up, I can buy something bigger and better later. That takes maturity. Faith is the same way. A faith that says I got to be rewarded now is not a mature faith. A faith that says I'm putting faith into the bank account of heaven. And I'm putting treasure in heaven and my reward is going to be in the long term. That's a mature faith. And that's what Abram had. So Abram wasn't perfect. Nobody but Jesus ever was. He just said yes to God. And then God told him that through him, through Abraham, through this, the unfaithful spouse, us, will be brought back into relationship with God again, even though we don't deserve it. What an amazing story. Now, next week, so far the news on Abram is great. We're about to see a totally different side of him next week. Next week, he's going to decide this is a really hard thing for God to do, so I'm going to help him out. And we're going to see how badly things go for Abram and the problems that it produced for generations because Abram decided God's not strong enough to do this. I need to help him out. So we're going to look at that next week with Abram and Sarai and Hagar and Ishmael and how everything goes wrong when Abram tries to help God out. We'll see you next week for that one.